There are two people sitting in the same therapy office right now. One grew up with a cold, emotionally distant father. The other grew up with a warm, present one. And the therapist is hearing the exact same problem from both of them. Because what shaped you wasn't just who your parents were, it was the version of yourself that formed in response to them. And most people never realize that version is still running. We talk about parenting constantly. Helicopter parents, permissive parents, strict parents, absent parents. We have entire shelves of books about how to raise children correctly. But almost none of that conversation focuses on what's actually happening inside the child. The psychological architecture that gets quietly built, brick by brick, in response to whoever raised you. And here's what's strange. You can have two people raised in the exact same household by the exact same parents and come out with completely different psychological blueprints. Because it wasn't just the parents, it was the relationship, the dynamic, the specific version of that parent that each child experienced. What researchers have spent decades uncovering is this. The parent you had doesn't just shape your childhood, it shapes the adult operating system you carry for the rest of your life. And most people are running software they've never once stopped to examine. The most critical period of psychological formation happens before you have the language to describe it. Between birth and roughly age 7, your brain is in a state neuroscientists call high neuroplasticity. It is actively wiring itself based on what it experiences. And the single most powerful input during that window is not your school, not your neighborhood, not what you watched on television. It's the primary caregiver, the person whose face you looked for first when something scared you. John Bowlby, the psychiatrist who developed attachment theory, spent decades documenting what happens when that early bond goes well and what happens when it doesn't. His research, later expanded by Mary Ainsworth through the famous strange situation experiments, identified something profound. The way your caregiver responded to you when you were distressed became the template your brain uses to predict how the world will respond to you forever. Think about that. Not just in childhood, forever. The expectation of how people will treat you when you're vulnerable was written before you could read a sentence. If your caregiver was consistently warm and responsive, your brain learned, when I need something, help comes. If they were unpredictable, warm sometimes, cold others, your brain learned, connection is unstable, stay alert. If they were absent or dismissive, your brain learned, needs are a burden, handle it yourself. Bowlby called these internal working models. Most people call them their personality. But here's what gets genuinely unsettling. Those models don't just affect how you feel, they affect what you see. They change the actual data your brain pays attention to in the world. And that's why two people raised differently can walk into the exact same room and come out with completely different versions of what just happened. Imagine you grew up with a parent who was loving but deeply critical. Approval was always followed by a condition. You did well, but you could have done better. You're smart, but you need to work harder. Over years, your brain built a filter that scans every interaction for the condition, for the but. Now, you're 34 years old in a performance review. Your manager says your work this quarter has been excellent, and something in you immediately starts waiting for the second half of the sentence. You can't fully receive the compliment because your brain isn't wired to trust it yet. It's still waiting for the but. And your manager has no idea any of this is happening. Developmental psychologists describe this as a cognitive schema, an unconscious interpretive lens that filters incoming information to match what you were conditioned to expect. Research from the University of Michigan found that adults with critical parental backgrounds were significantly more likely to recall negative feedback from supervisors over positive feedback, even when positive feedback was objectively more frequent. Your memory is not neutral. It is curated by the blueprint your parents built. You remember what confirms what you already learned at home. Here's one of the most talked about findings in relationship psychology, and one of the most resisted. You tend to recreate what you grew up with, not because you want to, not consciously, but because familiarity feels like safety to the nervous system, even when what's familiar is harmful. If you grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent, emotional unavailability feels like normal. When you meet someone warm and fully present, something in you might actually find it uncomfortable, too much, too soon, somehow untrustworthy. But when you meet someone who pulls away just enough, who keeps you guessing just enough, that registers as familiar, and the nervous system codes familiar as safe. A landmark study by researchers at the University of Toronto followed adults across a 15-year period and found that individuals with anxious attachment styles developed in response to inconsistent parenting were measurably more likely to enter and remain in relationships that replicated the emotional patterns of their original home environment. Not because they were weak or broken, but because the nervous system is always trying to resolve the original wound in the closest available context. You didn't choose that dynamic because you don't know better. You chose it because your brain recognized it. There's a profound difference. But here's where the research stops being just fascinating and starts being actually useful. Because understanding the blueprint is the first step to changing it, and the science on how that happens is clearer than most people realize. For a long time, the prevailing assumption in psychology was that early attachment patterns were largely fixed, that the blueprint written in childhood was the blueprint you carried forever. That assumption has been substantially revised. Neuroscientist Daniel Siegel, drawing on decades of research in interpersonal neurobiology, documented something he called earned security, the process by which adults who had difficult or inconsistent early attachments develop secure attachment patterns through intentional relationships and self-reflection later in life. The brain retains enough plasticity throughout adulthood to genuinely rewrite core relational templates. The mechanism is not complicated, but it requires something most people find deeply uncomfortable. It requires noticing the pattern while you're in it, not afterward, in reflection, during, in the moment when you feel the urge to shut down because someone got too close, in the moment when you catch yourself waiting for the but after every compliment, in the moment when a fight feels familiar in a way you can't quite name. That noticing, what psychologists call reflective functioning, is the intervention. The moment you can observe the blueprint operating in real time, you've created a gap between the old pattern and your response. And in that gap is where change actually lives. The research is consistent. People who develop the capacity to narrate their own childhood clearly, not bitterly, not in denial, but with honest coherence, show secure attachment patterns in their adult relationships, regardless of what their early home looked like. The story you can tell about your parents with clarity matters more than whether your parents were good or bad. Most people spend their lives reacting to parents they no longer live with. The cold father still sits at the table of every professional evaluation. The anxious mother still whispers in every relationship that seems too good. The absent one still makes you work for approval you don't actually need. They're not in the room, but the software they wrote is still running, and it's running in real time, shaping what you notice, what you trust, what you reach for, and what you decide you don't deserve. This isn't about blaming your parents. Most of them were running their own inherited blueprints, doing the best they could with the architecture they were handed. The cycle doesn't end with blame. It ends with awareness. The most important thing you were never taught in school is how the first relationship you ever had became the lens through which you see every relationship that followed. Your parents didn't just raise you, they built the room inside which you've been living ever since. You can redecorate, you can renovate, you can, with enough honesty and enough time, build something entirely new. But you can't change a room you don't know you're standing in. The first step is simply this: noticing the walls. If this opened something up for you, subscribe. We dig into the psychology most people sense but never fully see. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit the join button to become a channel member. It genuinely means a lot.